There are a lot of birds on this planet, and one could weigh them and or at least come up with estimates of how much they weigh. There are a lot of wild mammals on the planet. One could come up with an estimate of how much all of them would weigh. And then if one tried to estimate the biomass of the nematode worms, many of which are microscopic, one would realize that the sheer quantity of them would actually not only outnumber wild birds and mammals in terms of individuals, in terms of number of species, but also then just in sheer biomass. And then it would be interesting then perhaps to consider, just how much each of the groups of living things weigh. There's certainly a lot of people on the planet weighing more than all wild mammals combined. The livestock, which keeps this human population alive, would weigh even more. But then if one were to consider, well, what groups of animals represent the majority of animals on Earth? There's certainly a lot of mollusks, clams, snails and the like, a lot of annelids, a lot of cnidarians, which would include corals. There are certainly lots and lots of fish, but the largest group, we'd have to change the scale to first see fish. That's this second category with 700 megatons. But then also when we think of arthropods, the sheer quantity of arthropods mean that they are the most abundant animals on the planet in terms of individuals, in terms of number of species, and in terms of sheer biomass. If one were to exclude fish, arthropods would outweigh all other groups of animals combined. And so therefore it's appropriate to study them. But because there are so many and they're so important in the ecosystems of the world, there are just so many avenues that a lecture on arthropods could take. So what I'm going to do is begin with a quick overview for, say, students getting an overview of arthropods, and then go into a little bit more depth about their history, arthropods in the fossil record, and then a bit more in modern groups, especially those you might find in the Northeast United States, and their roles in ecosystems. So because this is such a huge topic, I'd like to make a couple passes through it and maybe take different points of emphasis each time. The first point is, while I'm going to focus on arthropods, there are a few groups of organisms which are almost arthropods, which have some of the features of arthropods, but not enough to call them arthropods. This becomes very important when we consider the fossil record and how arthropods evolved. So for example, tardigrades have legs, which is more advanced than worms, but they are unjointed legs, so they lack that feature of the arthropods of jointed limbs. That's what their name means. And so as we survey the invertebrates, whether it be tardigrades or the velvet worms, there are animals alive today which have some, but not all of the features of arthropods. But then, that begs the question, what makes an arthropod? When we get into the fossils, why is this group considered an arthropods and this group is not? One of the features of arthropod, as I said, are the jointed limbs that define them. There are other groups which do have limbs which are similar, but they're not jointed limbs. A hard exoskeleton made of chitin is another feature. Now, obviously, this helps for defense. It does pose a problem when it comes to growing, because if your skeleton is essentially on your outside, then you might have to molt or shed your skeleton in order to then expand. And so what many arthropods do is that they will molt and break out of their old chitin exoskeleton, and then there'll be a temporary period where they're vulnerable because their outer integument is not yet hardened, and so they can expand as the new one hardens. Notice that the jointed limbs then are a great adaptation. Once you have jointed limbs, then some can specialize for locomotion or prey capture, etc. And so jointed limbs then allow the arthropods then to adapt to different types of lifestyles. Not all legs have to be the same, as is evident in those grasshoppers. Arthropods can have two types of eyes. They can have simple eyes. And so there are lots of arthropods where this is all they have, and we'll see this in some of the aquatic organisms. But then you can also then have compound eyes made of separate omatidia. So here on the grasshopper, in addition to simple eyes, which there might be small simple eyes between the on the top of the head, then they would have these large compound eyes. And so thus the arthropods had vision in a way that many invertebrates don't. Many invertebrates can distinguish between light and dark, for example, but the ability to form a visual image is something that many invertebrate groups lack. The arthropods evolved it, and their vision has helped them in diverse ecological roles. Now, some arthropods have lost the eyes that their ancestors had, or at least at certain parts of their life cycle, like this termite here. Now, arthropods are such an enormous group, and I'll be introducing separate groups along the way, but perhaps the first big subdivision of the arthropods is to break them into the Chelicerata group versus the Mandibulata group. And the primary distinction then is in mouth parts. But since mouth parts can vary from group to group, so yes, so there, in general, there's a distinguish between, grasping mouth parts and crushing mouth parts. But, other subgroups have then modified the mouth parts from this. So one can't say that every member of this group has this, but in general, the Chelicerata have more grasping mouth parts than as Chelicerae. And this group would include the scorpions, spiders, ticks, horseshoe crabs, and the extinct trilobites. And so if you were to look then at this scorpion, this is a type of mouth part that no insect, for example, would have. And so the arthropod head has been made by lots and lots of segments fusing, and the mouth parts are modified limbs, which were once associated with some of these segments. So as lots of segments fused, some of the limbs which were associated with these segments could then be adapted in different ways for prey manipulation or other things. So here is the mouth parts of a tick. So once again, so this is one type, one subgroup which we could have. The second subgroup is the idea of mandibles, which have the ability then of being more crushing, although some have modified this to be piercing, instead. So once again, in general, the mandibulata would then include the crustaceans, the insects, the centipedes, and the millipedes. And you can see this is a very different type of mouth part in this termite. Here in the crab, these are crushing mouth parts. Here in this centipede, etc. So that's not the only reason to distinguish them. So if you were to compare their genes and gene sequences, for example, you would see that the Chelicerata versus the Mandibulata cluster has two separate groups. And once again, they have been modified. So some insects like those back swimmers have piercing mouth parts. That butterfly had a long proboscis, etc. So they can be modified subsequently. As I'll talk about with the fossil record, arthropods date back more than 500 million years, and they have been quite successful. Some groups like the scorpions alive today on land evolved from sea scorpions, which were quite successful during the Paleozoic. One group which is reminiscent of early arthropods are the horseshoe crabs, still alive today. So while we do not have trilobites still alive today, which were so common in the Paleozoic era, these arthropods, which are cousins of theirs, give us a sense of what type of organisms that they were. Once again, you notice the hard exoskeleton, the jointed limbs, which can then be adapted for prey capture, for burrowing, etc. And so horseshoe crabs, here you can see one burrowing. And here you can see the gills that they have, and notice that they're continually moving them so that water passes over the gills and they can perform respiration. So horseshoe crabs are an ancient group. Sea scorpions were marine and then came out onto land. And in the same way, spiders are evolved from animals which were originally marine. So the first arthropods were all aquatic. Relatives of spiders alive today would be ticks and mites, which clearly are important for the transfer of disease. At this moment that I'm making this video, I'm actually on antibiotics against Lyme, which I've gotten a couple of times because how much time I spend in the woods. And so diseases spread by ticks, certainly important. Here you can see a spider. These are almost entirely predators, and what they do is they pierce the bodies of their prey and inject their digestive enzymes and then kind of liquefy their prey and absorb then the organic molecules from there. So they don't take, say, a dragonfly into their stomach. They inject their digestive enzymes into the dragonfly and then absorb it that way. As we'll see, we could subdivide these. So for example, harvestmen are considered to be spiders, but very distantly related to all other groups. So while they are arthropods, one of the distinctions we can make is that, say, insects will have three main body parts, a head, a thorax, and an abdomen, while spiders have two, a head and an abdomen. And so the Chelicerata group includes scorpion, spiders, ticks, mites, horseshoe crabs alive today. The Mandibulata group includes centipedes and millipedes. Now they vary in a number of features. Millipedes tend to have 2 legs per body segment and tend to be herbivores, while centipedes tend to have one leg per body segment and tend to be carnivores. But you notice that the segmentation that I discussed in previous videos is so evident here. An easy way to build a body is once you have perfected all of the structures which can be part of one segment, then you can simply then duplicate that. Things like centipedes and millipedes, they were probably among the first animals to make it onto land. Crustaceans like this crayfish are arthropods in the Mandibulata group. And just a couple of thoughts on anatomy. First, you can see that there are these segmented limbs, which can be specialized for different things. Notice that these limbs versus these limbs aid in locomotion in different ways, but obviously these limbs can specialize in prey capture and defense. Very often there are antennae, which are sensory. And arthropods all have a complete digestive system. So there is a mouth and an anus. Notice a difference compared to the chordates and the vertebrates, which I'll be talking about in future videos, where all chordates have a post-anal tail. So the digestive system ends at a certain place, and then the tail beyond that does not have intestine. In contrast, in the protostomes, like this crayfish, we see that the intestine length stretches the length of the body, and that at the end of the digestive tract, the anus is at the very end of the abdomen. So that's a distinction from the chordates, which we'll see. Another distinction from the chordates is, notice that if this is the brain of the crayfish, notice that its nerve cord, you know, the equivalent of its spinal cord, is on the ventral side, the belly, and it's solid, while the heart is on the dorsal side. So we'll see that in typically in protostomes, you know, in insects, in mollusks, whereas the reverse is true in the vertebrates. The heart is on the ventral side, and the nerve cord is hollow, and it is on the dorsal side. So if you were dissecting a crayfish, as many general biology students do, there are digestive glands which secrete enzymes, and then there are specialized regions. While we could say, oh, that's the stomach, you know, some books will say that's the liver, they're not the equivalents of those organs which we define in vertebrates. And so one should be careful. You know, that's a digestive gland, and here's a specialized region of the digestive tract for grinding. But if one were to say, oh, that's the stomach, that's the liver, those are, you know, maybe just comparisons being made or used metaphorically. It's not a true liver in the vertebrate sense. Here are the gills of the crayfish. And once again, gills function as water passes over them, that oxygen can be removed. But then the key is water has to flow over them. And so if you're in stagnant water, how does that happen? And so, you know, a crayfish might be continually moving its legs, which would then pump water over the gills. So once again, here you can see, you know, what some, you know, books might call a stomach, others will say is a gastric mill. It's an area where food can be ground, you know, and it's specialized. Notice that here's a digestive gland, and that the intestine runs to the tip of the abdomen. Once again, that would be different from the situation in vertebrates. Also then notice in the next video that the nervous system, there is the ventral nerve cord, and it is running along the ventral side of the body, whereas our spinal cord runs along the dorsal side. One of the things we see in many of the arthropod groups is their respiratory structures can extract oxygen from water, but they can also extract oxygen from air. And so horseshoe crabs spend most of their life in the water, but they can come onto land to breed, and they breathe while they do that. Here you see a crab which can breathe using gills when underwater. But these gills, as long as they stay moist, can extract oxygen from the air as well. And so arthropods found it easy to adapt to life on land, more so than the mollusks did. Although there are, you know, slugs and snails on land, mollusks are not as successful on land as the arthropods ended up being. And so there are crabs which spend virtually their entire lives underwater, you know, almost never come on land. And then there are crabs which spend almost all their life on land and almost never go in the water, and many which can go back and forth. And so the respiratory system of arthropods can do gas exchange with in both water and air. And that then is true of crayfish as well. They are primarily aquatic. There are freshwater crayfish. Obviously, they have marine cousins, a variety of lobsters. So here you can see that the front appendages can be modified to varying degrees for defense and prey capture. And as we'll see in another video, which I'll get to in just a second, they can, these crayfish can also then come out onto land. So here you can see a crayfish on land using those pincers as for defense, whereas obviously they can also be used in prey capture. So a couple of other features. The first spiders were able to make silk, but probably not webs. They might have, say, used to make trip lines where prey might stumble across it, and then they could jump out and pounce the prey from their hiding place. There are many hunting spiders that do that today. They don't make webs. They use silk as a trip line. Silk is a wonderful protein which humans have obviously learned to utilize, and that is because of the structure of the amino acids, where they form this beta pleated sheet, which allows them to pack very closely together. So that's an important secondary structure of proteins. And so not all spiders make webs. Some webs are kind of amorphous, where just kind of a mass of silk fibers, whereas in many groups of spiders, the webs are quite intricate with a specific geometrical pattern, and there may be different types of silk. Some sticky, some less so, so that there will be strands that the spider would then walk along as it approaches captured prey, etc. So here you see spiders which are producing silk from spinnerets and creating a web. There are so many groups of arthropods. This is the most abundant, and diverse group of animals. So as I get into this later in this video, some of the arthropods we often forget of are the microscopic ones or near microscopic ones. And so when we speak of zooplankton, zooplankton are, the small organisms which, instead of being algae and performing photosynthesis like the phytoplankton, these are small animals that might be, say, feeding on bacteria, algae, and they're incredibly important as food for small fish like these. So small fish can't eat large prey, but they can ingest small animals like the arthropods in zooplankton. And so while zooplankton might not get great attention, nevertheless, it's the basis for many aquatic food chains. Also, many of the arthropods, which get larger later in life, like crabs, then have young stages, which would be present in the zooplankton. So this is a larva of a crab. And so as we go through the arthropod groups, the ones which are found in zooplankton, very important. As I'll be mentioning, one group of arthropods adapted not only to land, but then became the first insects. And insects can be recognized by a number of features, as I'll mention. They have a head, a thorax, and an abdomen, so 3 body segments, although in different stages of their life, like larvae, like caterpillars or fly larvae, they could be different. They have 3 pairs of legs, all originating from the thorax. They have antennae, compound eyes, and most insects have 2 pairs of wings. Now this fly would be different because one wing was modified to make a balancing structure known as a haltere. But the first insects actually lacked wings, so wings are not a defining feature of the insects, and some have lost them. Now I'm going to kind of switch gears in a second, but then obviously as we go through insects at the end, each group of insects has its own fascinating aspects, whether it be sound production, like in these katydids, as and other insects can make sound as well, as ridges on wings or on legs are rubbed together to make sound. We'll give it one more. So you can hear katydids in the background. I swear there's more. Whatever. and so, you know, there's interesting features there. Obviously, oh, I'm sorry, I've missed a few other ones. Whatever. And then, so whether it be discussing each group of insects, or then looking at you know, features of insects as a group, such as how they breathe. And then one would see, you know, there's different, you know, ways of, you know, say, for example, breathing in insects. So they can have openings known as spiracles, which let air in, and the movements of their body can help to pump air through these. But then there are also other possibilities. So here you can see some of the movement of, you know, limbs can help move air. But a number of insects or insect larvae have then adapted to life in aquatic environments. And so, for example, some, like dragonflies and damselflies, can actually take in water through their anus and use that to breathe. Dragonfly larvae can also then expel that and use that as a form of propulsion. Notice that some of the hemipterans have elongated tubes from the tip of their abdomen, once again, to use to breathe. So here's a water scorpion, which allows it to breathe air while hanging underwater. Some aquatic insects, when they dive, will actually take air bubbles down with them that adhere to bristles that they have, and they can use those bubbles as a source for oxygen. And so, you know, I'll get to insects again later, but we could speak of individual groups of insects. We could speak of adaptations of insects that they have for various types of environments, etc. So next thing, I just want to address the history of arthropods because they are an ancient group going back at least to the beginning of the Cambrian, with potentially some relatives even predating that. So if you were to consider the Ediacaran period, which was the period prior to the Cambrian, there are a number of animals which seem to have some arthropod features, not enough to be called arthropods, but nevertheless, they seem to be more advanced than any group of worms that we know of. And so, once again, it would appear that it is possible to have some of the features of arthropods, but not all. In fact, as the Cambrian period began, some of the major predators were known as anomalocarids, including, you know, some forms which would get to be 3 feet long, which was in the Cambrian oceans, you know, about as big as Lake Got, so a super predator by those standards. They had an outer shell of chitin, they had segments, they had compound eyes, but they did not have segmented limbs the way arthropods do. And also their mouth parts were different. This is beyond the scope of, you know, this lecture, but once again, arthropods had a very unique fusion of head segments to form the arthropod head. And so one could look in fossil groups and ask, do they have that type of fusion? And the answer in these groups is no. So they have heads, but it's not the arthropod head, even if they do have antennae and segments and the like. And so both today in the tardigrades and the velvet worms, and then also in you know, the ancient fossil seas, you know, there were animals which had compound eyes, which had limbs, but they weren't jointed limbs. Or if they were jointed limbs, they certainly weren't, you know, animals which were arthropods. I mean, this head in this odd structure, even though it has jointed limbs and an exoskeleton, it's certainly not an arthropod head. It's kind of more like a suction cup. And so prior to any modern arthropod, there were a number of ancient animals which had some, but not all, of the features of arthropods. And once again, apparently the arthropod body plan was developed in stages. And then even when arthropods did appear, they were not crayfish or crabs or insects or millipedes. Instead, in the Cambrian, perhaps the most diverse and abundant animals were the arthropod trilobites. There were just thousands of species of these, and so they're very common fossils to find in the early Paleozoic. Once again, their cousins alive today are the trilobites, and so if you wanted to get an idea of, the limbs that I'm sorry, the horseshoe crabs that trilobites would have had, then horseshoe crabs are their closest relatives. And not only were there this enormous diversity, but each part of the world had its own unique fauna, as did different time periods. So not all trilobites coexisted at the same time. And so therefore, when we consider human history, there were different nations and empires which were dominant, say 2,000 years ago, 1,000 years ago, 500 years ago. They didn't all coexist. And in the same way as we look at animals which were dominant, there were trilobites which were common in the Cambrian period, and this is the only time period where these fossils are known. There are trilobites from the Ordovician period, and many people who were studying the Earth were even looking for mineral deposits like oil, then use these because they say, aha, the only times that this species has ever been found has been the Silurian period or the Devonian period. We can also then get an appreciation of the history of life because, for example, there were some mass extinctions. There was a mass extinction at the end of the Ordovician period. There was a mass extinction at the end of the Devonian. This coincides with when the northern and southern continents were fusing, when Africa and North America collided, when the Appalachian Mountains rose. And you can see that the diversity of trilobites in the Cambrian was greatly reduced by the Ordovician, greatly reduced even more by the Devonian extinctions. And in the end Permian extinctions, were the absolute worst extinction periods in Earth's history, with more than 90% of life becoming extinct. The last of the trilobites became extinct at that time. And so trilobites were certainly significant in the fossil record, but there were also then many others. So as I mentioned, there were a variety of sea scorpions, eurypterids, which were known, including this one, which can be more than 6 feet long and is the state fossil of New York. No, I'm sorry, there's a different, my fault. This is the largest one. There was, it's a different sea scorpion, which is the state fossil of New York. I apologize. And so there was a variety, but once again, they are only known in specific blocks of time. So they do have terrestrial relatives which have survived to the modern day, but different time periods then had different groups of fossil arthropods. For most of Earth's history, there was no life on land. It was in the Paleozoic that we have first evidence of simple plants on land, certainly no trees or flowering plants until much, much later. But also arthropods made it onto land early. And so things like millipedes probably would have been the very first animals on land long before there were any vertebrates on land. Later, and during the Carboniferous period, there were millipedes which could get to be, say, 12 feet long in length. The Carboniferous period had a higher level of oxygen in the air than we have in the modern day. And so there were dragonfly relatives which had wingspans of 3 feet. There were giant spiders with heads about, or with bodies about the size of my head. And so arthropods did do, there were other groups in the past, and some of the fossil groups were distinct from today. Now, just as scorpions on land evolved from scorpions in the water, the same would apply to spiders. Long before there were spiders on land, there were marine relatives, there were terrestrial relatives, which were not true spiders. The earliest spider-like animals and true spiders were distinct from ones of today. So for example, in having silk openings but no spinnerets to make the silk strands, or in having a segmented abdomen that no modern spider has, etc. And so the spiders which we have today evolved in stages. And the same thing with insects. There were, before any modern group of insects, the first insects to make it onto land were wingless insects. They lacked wings. They had abdominal legs, which, vestigial forms of these still exist in simple insects like some wingless insects, but not to this extent. They had odd, head parts and manipulating structures. So the original insects were not any modern group. And there are a few modern lineages like these springtails, which are wingless today, which stem from the earliest groups of insects. Here's another wingless insect alive today. And if you look very closely, you can see, in addition to the 6 major legs that define the insects, that one had some abdominal legs that you can barely make out, which was a trait of the primitive insects. The development of wings was one of the great advances in insects, and that also went through stages. So the earliest wings, last I checked, were not movable. They were just more kind of like hang gliding structures where wind could then disperse them, but they were rigid structures. Other early wings, are not as complex as those of modern insects here. A lot of early insects had wing-like short stubby structures on their first thoracic lobe, whereas the true wings are developed on the next 2 in modern insects. So this suggests that it was thoracic lobes, which were not wings, which were the ancestral structures leading to wings. When winged insects first appeared, once again, they were not the insects of today. They were primarily a number of extinct groups. And their ecology was different. While most insects today have chewing mouth parts, the earliest ones had more piercing mouth parts. So it was a long time before you can find fossils of plant leaves, which seem to have been chewed by insects. Once again, some of them reach a great size, like dragonfly relatives, which have wingspans of 3 feet. There were no cockroaches in the Paleozoic, but there were cockroach relatives, and the same with proto-orthopterans. They were not grasshoppers, but in that clade. And so the groups of insects which we have today, they evolved in stages from ancestors which, kind of were in the group, but were not having the features that the modern ones have. Most of the early insect groups became extinct at that end Permian extinction, and then it was in the Mesozoic era, alongside the dinosaurs, that many of the groups which we have today evolved for the first time, like bees and ants and butterflies, etc. And there were transitional forms, like the earliest flies still had 2 sets of wings as opposed to the 1 set of wings that modern flies have. And so when we look back in the fossil record, whether it be in the ocean or on land, we certainly do not see the diversity of arthropods which we have today. When insects were first on land, there were not bees and ants and beetles and grasshoppers and the like. When arthropods were first in the water, they were not crayfish and crabs. These groups evolved gradually. Finally, many biologists then focus on wildlife, ecosystems, food chains, and the like. And obviously, given that arthropods are the most abundant animals on Earth, whether in terms of biomass or number of species or number of individuals, then clearly many biologists end up studying arthropods either directly or in animals, which then feed uh, on on them, given that arthropods are then parts of food chains. And so there are so many groups of arthropods that I didn't mention. And one of the ways you might realize, get a feel for this is just by sampling the small arthropods which live in a pond near you. Now, going through this enormous group is beyond a scope of a single lecture. So I just would like to introduce those. So I have a playlist titled Freshwater Food Chains, which would then introduce a number of these different groups of arthropods that one might find in a freshwater environment near here, like Daphnia water fleas or other brachiopods. There are groups, there is a group known as the ostracodes, and one of the things that makes them interesting is that they actually make what resembles a shell. So their thorax actually forms a bivalved shell. So if you look at that, you might think that that was a little clam, but then inside you realize, here's something with arms and legs reaching out of, that shell-like structure. So this is a type of aquatic arthropod. There are so many other ones. So there are a group known as the copepods. You can find them in freshwater. They're very important as zooplankton in marine life as well. So so here you can see a freshwater one swimming around. There are arthropods known as isopods here, which you can find in freshwater near you. There are others which look a bit more like millipedes called amphipods. And so these are just groups of arthropods. Once again, we're outside insects, spiders, scorpions, and the like. So these are subgroups of arthropods, say crustaceans, which have all of these diverse species that are very important in aquatic food chains. Now, while insects primarily live on land, there are many insects which have adapted to aquatic life, and there are then insects which then have aquatic larvae, and then will then become adults, which are terrestrial. So there are some fly larvae known as chironomids. Some of these actually have a red pigmentation and are called bloodworms. And so as we talk about why these might be of interest, not only is this important for those who are studying aquatic ecosystems, but then also if you were interested, say, in fishing, a lot of those who do a lot of fishing then are very expert in different types of aquatic invertebrates, because their lures or flies are attempting to mimic these. Obviously, mosquitoes have larvae which are aquatic, and so standing water can then cause more mosquito to thrive in an area. And so sometimes swamps are drained, or people make sure that they dump out standing water near their house to limit mosquitoes. Now, certainly, since mosquitoes are here, you can see the siphon that they use to breathe, so that they're breathing in atmospheric air while they're hanging suspended in the water where they can feed on algae and the like. When I lived in South America, I remember on a trip to Brazil, this one gentleman was just making a point of just going over everywhere and tipping over all standing water, and that was because the The mosquito larvae are not just a pest, but they can also spread diseases like malaria. Malaria is obviously a devastating uh, disease for humans. And so, while we can focus on land primarily, there's all of these other scenarios where some insects as adults live in the water. And so, for example, there are beetles, which are aquatic beetles. Some of them have adapted to life so well that they have two sets of eyes, one set which will see predators from above and one set looking for a prey in the water beneath. Some of another group of insects which can live in water as adults are the hemipterans, which, there are giant water bugs, there are water scorpions, there are back swimmers. All of these hemipterans tend to have piercing mouth parts, and so can actually provide a bit of a sting even for humans on rare occasions if you try to, say, handle a back swimmer. Like this one, whose very long hind legs, are used to paddle itself around. And so, in addition to, so some insects, they live in water their entire, as adults, while other ones, this is just the larval stage. So famously, the dragonflies and damselflies. So here you see a damselfly. That's what the adult looks like. But the larvae then has gills attached to the tip of its abdomen. You can see that here. And so the larvae are aquatic predators. The same would be true of dragonflies. They are aquatic predators as larvae, and then after they get to a certain size, they'll come out onto land and molt, and their wings will form. So here you can see a variety of the larvae here. Now, once again, there are just so many here that I'm going to wrap up, but I do have playlists in my YouTube channel on wildlife of the Northeast United States. Now, a lot of those videos are about, birds and frogs and mammals. But then I also have some on beetles, which, just attempt to introduce a number of, the beetles that one could find in our area, which would include the whirligigs. These are those beetles I had mentioned, which have the two pairs of eyes, so they can look both above and below. And then, diverse beetles. So, for example, not a lot of individuals would recognize that this is a beetle which is camouflaged to blend in with a flower so that it can, prey on insects which then, come to the flower, for pollen and the like. Obviously, there are so many groups of insects that we then, identify as orders. So it would be, for example, the order Orthoptera, which would include the grasshoppers, the order Lepidoptera, which would include the butterflies and moths, who are so important for pollination. But whose larvae, those caterpillars, can be serious pests agriculturally. There would be, the order Hymenoptera, which would include the ants, the bees, and the wasps, etc. The order Diptera, which includes flies. And so once again, if you were a biologist, very often after studying, these are what makes the insects, the arthropods and arthropod, or insects and insects, you would then start getting into, subdivisions of this and study individual orders and families and species. So arthropods are the most abundant animals on the planet in terms of individuals, with the possible exception of the nematode worms. They're microscopic, and so I'm sure we have, individuals there that we don't quite understand their immensity as much. But certainly as far as biomass, you saw with the exception of fish, it's estimated that arthropods would outweigh all other animals combined. And this video was just kind of an introduction into their diversity.